So when it comes to practice, is there something that we're doing wrong? Are there certain kinds of unskillful states that can actually be useful to us in certain circumstances? We'll look at that coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing. So if we know about the Buddha's message to us in the early texts, the Pali Canon, we'll know that the Buddha distinguishes between certain kinds of mental states, certain kinds of emotions that we may have, certain of them being skillful and useful to us, and others of them being unskillful and not very useful to us. And his general approach was to beef up, if you like, the ones that are skillful, and to try to denourish the ones that are unskillful. That in a nutshell is kind of his approach, understood in, again, a 10,000-foot kind of approach to his view of practice. But are there certain kinds of unskillful states, unskillful emotions, unskillful ways of being, that are unskillful in daily life and in many respects, but can be useful to us in our practice in certain respects? And that's what we're going to really tackle here. Because it seems like there's a distinction between certain unskillful states and others for the Buddha. And so what we're going to do here is look at a couple of those, and we'll look at some texts from the early tradition. And then at the end, we'll try to distinguish between the respects in which these unskillful states are unskillful and the respect in which they aren't. But to begin with, let's look at a state which definitely is unskillful for the Buddha, and which there's sort of no way of recovering any kind of skillful use out of this state. And perhaps the most famous example of an emotional state or a mental state which is really not useful to us under any circumstances for the Buddha. We find this example in the Alagadupama Sutta, or the Sutta on the water snake, where the Buddha is arguing with a monastic named Aritta, and Aritta seems to have a view that sensual enjoyment is useful to him along the path. So he seems to be interested in sensual enjoyment. In particular, it seems, at least from the commentarial material, as though he was having sex, even though he was a monastic and not supposed to. And he seemed to believe that that was fine for him to do. And the Buddha argues strenuously against this. The Buddha's claim here is that indulgence in sense enjoyment is, as he said, the word is obstructive of liberation. That's how he puts it. It obstructs our ability to attain liberation. Now, this may be a surprise to some of us, and it's, in a certain sense, a very big topic which we could use a whole bunch of lectures to get at, or videos or teachings to get at. But the basic idea is that if, insofar as we indulge in sense enjoyment, that is to say, indulge in our tendency to enjoy visible things that we see and things that we taste and things that we hear and all the rest of the senses, that tends to bind us to the world. That tends to make us more attached to the world. And insofar as we are more attached to the world, we're more prone to feeling dukkha, feeling this sort of internal sense that we have that's expressed in the First Noble Truth, that life is unsatisfactory. Because, of course, these sense enjoyments don't persist. So in any event, this is one example where the Buddha says indulgence in sense enjoyment is obstructive of liberation. Indulgence in sense enjoyment basically, without fail, tends to cause to arise certain kinds of mental states, certain kinds of thoughts, certain kinds of ideas, certain kinds of attachments to things in the world, and there's no way to get around that. So insofar as we're pursuing the path, we have to be aware of this and aware of the dangers involved in sense enjoyment and enjoying sense pleasures. So that's an example of a kind of approach, a mental state that is unskillful and that there's really no help for it along the path. It is obstructive of liberation. However, there are other examples of unskillful mental states that don't seem to suffer the same, necessarily, don't seem to suffer the same kinds of fates. And here we'll look at a different text. In this text, the layman Visakha is asking the nun, the bhikkhuni Dhammadina, bhikkhuni means a nun in Buddhism, and he's asking her a bunch of questions. There's a sutta that's just taken up with these questions that Visakha is asking Dhammadina. Now, in the commentary, it says that Visakha used to be married to Dhammadina. They were a couple, and then Dhammadina decided to take on robes, and as a result, they're no longer married because, of course, she's a nun. But her husband at the time allowed her to do that. In other words, he didn't have to. I mean, in the patriarchal society of India, I think you really sort of had to have your husband's blessing to do that, and he gave her his blessing. But then after she took on robes, he looked to her as a teacher, basically. So, I mean, we don't necessarily have to believe the commentary. Certainly not in every circumstance is the commentary credible, but it's at least an interesting potential background to the story. So in any event, one of the questions that the Visakha asks Dhammadina, he says, basically that whenever we feel a pain, we have a tendency to aversion. In other words, we're aversive to that pain. We want to push it away. Aversion is a mental, kind of an emotional state. And he asks Dhammadina whether we should always try to get rid of this aversion, whether this aversion is always unskillful to us. And the nun Dhammadina, surprisingly, I think, says no, that in fact, not in every case is aversion a bad thing. Not in every case is aversion basically unskillful. Although, taken, from a 10,000-foot level, aversion is an unskillful state. But there are certain circumstances under which aversion can be skillful, at least in the context. And what is that context? Dhammadina says that if we have a kind of a longing for liberation, and presumably she did, and people who are very dedicated to the path, very dedicated to practice, may have a kind of a longing for liberation, a wish to be beyond, as it were, the sorrows of life. She says that longing for liberation can produce in us a kind of a sadness, and that sadness is essentially an aversion to the pain that we're feeling in our lives. It's in a kind of an aversive, if you like, an aversive emotion. And she says that aversive emotion, that sadness, can basically give us energy to pursue our practice. And so what happens is the aversion that we have, the sadness that we have towards things that are painful to us in life, can spur us on in our practice, and then that practice can then culminate in the ending of aversion. So it may sound a little bit paradoxical, but it's not really paradoxical. Basically, what she's saying is that aversion can lead us in a path that leads to the end of aversion. And similarly, in a different sutta, Ananda, who was the Buddha's close attendant, talks about craving and conceit, and whether those can be useful to us along the path. And basically he says that craving and conceit can be useful to us insofar as they're directed towards liberation in particular ways. So for example, Ananda says that those who are practicing along the path think, oh, when will I too realize the undefiled freedom of heart and freedom by wisdom in this very life? After some time, relying on craving, they give up craving. So this is very much, we'll see, very much like Dhammadina's point about aversion. But instead of aversion, here we're talking about craving. And it's also important here to see, this is another thing we can see, is the way that craving and aversion are basically the flip side of each other. They're both the same kind of state, it's just one is the flip side of the other. So when we're aversive to certain things, it's because we're craving other things, and vice versa. So in this example, what Ananda is talking about is craving. The people can crave liberation. And since they crave liberation, that craving can spur them on, can give them energy to pursue the path, and that pursuit of that path then ends in the ending of craving. Again, somewhat paradoxical sounding, but not really paradoxical when we look at it, and when we consider how actually it might work. So that's craving, but what about conceit? Because conceit is may seem to us a somewhat stronger or somewhat more clearly unskillful state. Now, for the Buddha, conceit had three different flavors. There was conceit in the sense of thinking ourselves better than others. That's usually the standard way we use it in English. Also for the Buddha, there's conceit in the sense of thinking ourselves worse than others. That's a kind of conceit too. And there's also the conceit of thinking ourselves equal to others, which is very surprising, but that is also for the Buddha a kind of conceit. Conceit for the Buddha simply means a kind of comparing mind. This willingness or tendency that we have to compare ourselves to others in whatever way it might be. And we don't always compare ourselves to others by thinking that we're better than them, although that happens all too often. But sometimes we think that we're thinking of ourselves as worse, sometimes we're thinking of ourselves as equal. For the Buddha, any of those is, in the final analysis, unskillful, because it doesn't matter what other people are doing, really. In the final analysis, it doesn't matter what other people are doing. What matters is ourselves, what we're doing on the path. And this also reifies our sense of self, our ego, in a way that's not really helpful in the longest term. But how is it useful, at least in the shorter term, along the path? And here, again, Ananda talks and says that those practicing along the path think, well, that venerable can realize the undefiled freedom of heart and freedom by wisdom in this very life. Why can't I? After some time, relying on conceit, they give up conceit. So again, conceit, the comparing mind, is usually unskillful. And in the longest term, it's unskillful, absolutely. I mean, we really do have to get rid of that kind of thinking. But in the short term, if it spurs us along the path by making us look at others who are more advanced than we are, who have gotten, at least in our opinions, farther, and we might be wrong, of course, but at least in our opinions, people who have gotten farther, that can be a spur to our own energy, to our own effort along the path. And insofar as it's doing that, then once again, we're using conceit to get us to a place that's beyond conceit, where we will eventually give up that conceit. I mean, because in awakening, part of what awakening is supposed to be in the early tradition is giving up such views as conceit, such comparing mind, this notion that we are, separate and permanent individuals, and essentially that we have this unchanging core to ourselves. And once we give that up, and once we give up this notion of self, the giving up of conceit will happen as well. Now, what I've done here is to show one example of an emotional state that is always unskillful for the Buddha, indulgence in sense pleasures. And I've given a couple of other ones or three, I guess, depending on how you count, that can be useful under certain circumstances. That is, aversion and craving and conceit can be useful under certain circumstances. Now, the question is, what's the difference here? Because you might take this as sort of throwing up your hands and saying, I don't understand why one is useful and the other isn't. The difference, I think, comes down to the way that these emotional states are put to use in our lives. And in particular, the ones that are useful are ones that we can put towards what's called supramundane ends. In other words, path ends along the path. And the ones that can't be useful, are always not useful, are ones that can't be done that way, that are always, as the Buddha would say, mundane. Or it's said in a couple of early texts, mundane, but that's the general approach. That is, indulgence in sense pleasures is always worldly, because sense pleasures have to do with our physical interaction with things in this world. Whereas craving and conceit and aversion to awakening, or to our lack of awakening in the case of aversion, those are a little bit more refined. In other words, we're not directing our emotions towards objects in this world to which we can become attached, but rather we're directing our minds towards higher ends, towards ends along the path. And while we can, of course, become attached to those things too, that seems to, at least for the Buddha, for the early tradition, seems to have been less of a problem. In other words, That's a problem, but it's a much less significant problem. It's not one that he really discusses very much. And the point being that if we become attached to those things, it tends to be a much more subtle attachment that will on its own go away as we reach those final stages. And this is, of course, something that I don't have any personal experience with, but at least that's what we're told. Look, the ego can get in our ways along the path just as well as it can get in our ways in daily life. That is to say, if we are having conceit about our lack of abilities along the path, we're comparing ourselves to others who are ahead of us, that can lead to all kinds of problems. That can lead to low self-esteem, that can lead to beating up on ourselves, that can also lead to jealousy, other kinds of bad mental states that are associated with conceit. Another really important thing to get across here is that sometimes when we're discussing early Buddhism, we tend to identify unskillful with unethical. And there's a way in which that's correct, in the sense that all of the Buddha's notions of ethics come down to notions of not being skillful in the world, not really acting in the right way, rather than an ethics, let's say, of divine command or something. But the category of being unskillful is quite a bit larger than the category of being unethical. So when the Buddha says that indulgence in sense pleasures is unskillful, that it's obstructive of liberation, he's not saying it's unethical by any means, and we have to be very careful about that. So if you enjoyed the talk, give it a thumbs up. If you're new here, consider subscribing. And if you've been here around here for a while, check out my Patreon page. You might be interested in some of the stuff over there. So thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. Be well.